today. Good afternoon to those of you here in Venable's D.C. office, and good afternoon or good morning to those of you who have dialed in from across the country to participate in today's program entitled The Postal Service's Financial Crisis, What It Means for Nonprofit Mailers. My name is Jeff Tenenbaum. I'm the chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Practice here at the Venable Law Firm. We're very delighted to be co-hosting this program with the Alliance of Nonprofit Mailers. As many of you know, we do a series of monthly nonprofit legal seminars and webinars here in our offices every month. This is kind of a bonus program. We actually did one earlier this week, but we're excited to co-host this program today. It's a very important, very interesting, very fast-moving topic that you're going to be very fortunate to hear from four terrific speakers today who are very knowledgeable on the topic, have been steeped in the world of nonprofit postal rates and related issues for many years, and you're going to get some really terrific insights here today. I want to give you, and we'll get to our speakers in a minute, in case you're interested in other nonprofit legal topics, this is on the screen now as a preview of some of our upcoming programs that we'll be doing over the coming months. We'll do one in February, of course. Just haven't nailed that topic down yet. But if you're interested in participating in any of our programs, they're all complimentary, whether you come here for lunch or join us on the telephone. Always feel free to sign up to be notified for those events. Today's program, as I mentioned, is being recorded, and all of you, both in person and on the phone, will receive an email tomorrow that contains a link to the recording of the program along with the streaming PowerPoint presentation, so feel free to share that with colleagues or others who might be interested. In terms of questions and answers, we're going to do this a little bit different format than we typically do for our monthly seminars. We do have four speakers. Neither one of them, in terms of their prepared remarks, none of them have particularly lengthy remarks. They all do have some important initial things they want to say, and then we're going to essentially have an extended Q&A session and a lot of back and forth amongst and between the speakers. So kind of save up your questions as we go and then pose them once we open it up for questions. Those of you here in the room, just raise your hands and you can ask your questions. For those of you on the telephone, you need to use the chat feature on the webcast software. I'll be monitoring the laptop here at the front of the room, and we'll pose questions to our speakers at the appropriate times. I want to introduce now our four panelists for today's program in the order in which they will be speaking. First, second from the end there is Tony Conway. Tony is the Executive Director of the Alliance of Nonprofit Mailers, a coalition of nonprofit organizations that depends on affordable mail delivery. Prior to his current position, Mr. Conway had a 34-year career with the U.S. Postal Service, where he managed relations with the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. On our far right, my colleague David Levy has been practicing postal law since 1983 and has been co-chair of Venable's Postal Practice Group since 2008. He has served as first-chair counsel for one or more mailer associations in every major postal rate case in the last 30 years. Venable's Postal Trade Association clients include the Alliance, the Magazine Publishers of America, and the Association of Postal Commerce. David and his colleagues in our postal group also advise individual mailers, including nonprofits and for-profits, on compliance with the Postal Service's eligibility and mail preparation requirements, and represent individual mailers in disputes with the Postal Service and in connection with investigations by the Postal Inspection Service and the Department of Justice. To my immediate right is Ann Fisher. Ann is Director of Public Affairs and Government Relations at the Postal Regulatory Commission. Ms. Fisher previously served as the lead staffer on postal issues for 3 different U.S. senators, including work as the Deputy Staff Director on the Committee of Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. In that position, Ms. Fisher worked for Senator Susan Collins, the primary sponsor of the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006. And finally, to Ann's right is Jeffrey Post. Jeff is a professional staff member for the U.S. House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Mr. Post began working on Capitol Hill in 2007 and joined the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform in 2011 as the lead staff assistant working on postal reform. So as you can see, I think we have the bases covered in terms of expertise. You really are going to have some terrific insights into the topic today, and I hope you enjoy it. One final recognition, my colleague George Constantine, co-chair of our firm's regulatory practice, who's been heavily involved in nonprofit postal issues for many years, is here with us today. So with that, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tony to get us started. Tony?
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you all for coming here and everybody that's doing it via the internet. Yesterday, I'm sure you all have seen, yesterday the Postal Service announced its fiscal year-end financial results, and they were probably a little more dismal than most had expected. They announced they'd lost $16 billion for the fiscal year, which ended October 31. It's a combination of the loss was huge, I think, primarily due to, number one, their operating losses are big. Number two, they had two retiree health care pre-funding obligations that ended up in this year's ledger, last year's and this year's. So that totaled a little over $10 million, and that had a lot to, or $11 million. That had a lot to do with the loss. If you look at the losses last year, the $5.1 billion loss in 11, it had the payment not been deferred, the $5.5 billion payment that was due last year not been deferred. It would have been a $10 billion loss last year, and this year's would be about a $10.5 billion. So the jump isn't necessarily that huge. It's obviously a big problem, but it's a timing issue. In 10, you can see it was $8.5 billion. It's been declining, and all the trends show that it's just going to continue to decline if there aren't some major structural problems. Also this year, for the first time in its history, since it was reorganized in 1971, the Postal Service reached its borrowing limit, statutory borrowing limit of $15 billion. They have no more that they can borrow according to law. In terms of mail volume, which drives obviously a lot of their financial problems, it peaked in 2006. Total mail volume was $213 billion, and it's been rapidly falling ever since. This year's mail volume on the slide, I should point out, it says 165. I was projecting that when I put these slides together. Actually, it turned out to be 160 billion pieces they carried this year, so it was 5 billion than some people had projected. The projections are it's going to continue. We haven't bottomed out. Who knows how low it's going to go, but it's going to continue to decline. And I might point out also that while total mail volume peaked in 2006, first-class mail volume, which is the bread, that is the primary revenue source for the Postal Service, that had started declining 2 or 3 years prior to that point. So first-class mail had started the decline. It was covered a little bit, masked a little bit by the growth of standard mail, but now they're both plummeting at pretty substantial rates. The cost reductions, well, Postal Service, 80% of their costs are labor-related. Despite billions and billions of dollars in investment in automated equipment and so on, that percentage has remained the same, again, since the Postal Service was reorganized in 1971, when it was taken out of the cabinet and it was no longer the Post Office Department. It was made the United States Postal Service, which was supposed to operate more like a business, but it still remains heavily labor-related. And 85% of postal employees are unionized, and despite the fact that revenues are declining, the labor costs continue to increase. The collective bargaining agreements the Postal Service has with its 4 major unions continue to have provisions that call for compensation increases. So while the Postal Service over the last, since 2006, volume's been plummeting down and they've been losing billions of dollars, compensation rates have continued to increase. In terms of the total size of the Postal Service, and the next slide here gives you a feel for it. GAO in 2011 noted there were 461 mail processing facilities. GAO at that time suggested about half of them are unneeded. It's these big mail processing facilities. There's several in the D.C. area. They're all over the country. There's a lot of critical mass there because they typically employ a lot of people. And you get back to the labor cost issue. You have a plant. You have a bunch of people in it. It's a costly operation. So it's, again, the plant capacity is about twice as big as it should be. And I also should point out on that slide, which is kind of an interesting part of it, is even when the Postal Service peaked at 213 billion pieces of mail in '06, the GAO had reports out at that time, and they'd been issuing them actually for the last 15, 20 years, that there was substantial excess capacity in the plants. So this problem with excess capacity didn't start as the mail started to plummet. It was already there in a big way. So this is just really aggravating the problem by having mail decline. The employees, as you can see, again, GAO number in 11, a healthy part of the total number of people in mail processing facilities were thought to be excess. The equipment, again, a lot of very expensive mail processing equipment that's been purchased over the years. Almost a half of it is thought to be excess, according to GAO. Post offices nationwide, it's roughly 32,000. That's a challenging number to ever get your arms around. Those are little post offices, big post offices in cities and rural areas. One thing in terms of post offices, and I include this, I recall this well when I was with the Postal Service, there are 53 post offices on Cape Cod. You all know how big Cape Cod is, and you'll probably have a feel for whether or not they need 53 post offices or not, but they're there, and trying to change or close one is not an easy thing. In terms of what the Postal Service has proposed to address this crisis, they started with a plan in 2010 where they announced the big crisis, and they laid out a pretty long laundry list of things they wanted to do to address it. Those goals of the Postal Service have been modified in the last couple of years several times by the Postal Service, and so that too is kind of a moving target. But the primary elements that they're looking for is, number one, eliminate Saturday mail delivery. That has been their primary wish for several years now, and they estimate they could save around $3 billion a year. And it's about 35,000 people that they would no longer need full-time people if Saturday were delivered. That is a big-ticket item in terms of closing the gap. That's a big one for the Postal Service. Close and consolidate excess mail processing facilities, number two. They have started that, not the closing necessarily, but the consolidation. They've run into a buzzsaw on Capitol Hill on that. And so they have had to tone down their initial plans, and they're going more cautiously and more slowly. They're getting some savings, but as evidenced by the total losses, the savings aren't coming quickly enough. Expand retail access at non-traditional locations. That's one of the things the Postal Service really thinks it would be a good thing, not only reduce costs, but to create better access for customers. Instead of the traditional brick-and-mortar post office where you go in for that, they want to partner with drugstores and with grocery stores and everywhere else where people are already in. They could save some money, and they think they could also increase sales. That is also run into a buzzsaw. There are two postmaster organizations. They're not unions. They're called management associations, but they very much have pushed back on the idea of moving out of post offices. They like the idea of keeping post offices open. Modify the current inflation-based price cap, another thing the Postal Service has argued for. Right now, the law was changed in '06. The act with that Ann Fisher over here had a major role in getting passed, but established a very important element of current law for nonprofits and all mailers, and that is an inflation-based price cap that applies at the mail class level. That's a key element. The Postal Service's proposal is to apply it across all mail classes. That would give them a whole lot more flexibility to increase prices within classes. It's something I think most all mailing organizations are opposed to substantially. I know the Alliance is one of those that think it's a very bad idea. Expand products and services. The Postal Service for years has wanted to get into different lines of work and different lines of revenue. And they typically, when they trot something up, if it gets up to the hill, they run into a buzzsaw. Typically, a couple different arguments come out. One is, you're having a hard time delivering the mail to begin with. What makes you think you could be successful doing something in a different line of work? That's kind of the cynical approach that you hear a lot from on Capitol Hill. But the more important one really is the pushback you get from the private sector saying, no, we don't want to have to compete with the federal government, especially when the federal government has a legal monopoly over what they're doing. That's unfair competition. That argument has been raised a number of times over the last 25, 30 years, and so far it has won out every time. So the Postal Service's ability to get into new and different things is somewhat limited. The next slide, the reduced retiree health benefit pre-funding requirement. That's that big $5+ billion a year payment. They haven't made it for the last 2 years. It's a killer of a number. The rationale for why the Postal Service should pre-fund its health benefit liability for retirees, it's a very valid and it's a legitimate argument. I think the question really is the size of the prepayment unrealistic at this point? I think most people realize it is unrealistic, but how do you get it changed? That's one of the things that my two colleagues on the left will talk about. And the second one, the return to retirement system overpayment. That whole issue was kind of deflated in a big way by a letter from the OPM director, John Berry, to the Postmaster General on October 30, where they have changed the long-term projected interest rates, and as a result, there's two Postal Service retirement plans, the FERS plan and the CSRS. The FERS funding had shown, until this interest rate change was adopted, had shown the Postal Service about $11 billion overpaid that fund. And that was a significant component of the legislation that has been, actually it's passed the Senate and it's staged in the House, it's out of committee. But returning that or crediting that money to the Postal Service, that $11 billion, would have been a nice bump in immediate financial relief. They could have used it to help pay down that $15 billion debt, perhaps provided some of it to incent employees to retire, but it's no longer $11 billion according to this new, according to OPM, it's more like $3 billion. And the other retirement system, perhaps, it looks to be maybe underfunded now as a result of that new number. So that has thrown that issue on its ear, and that will have to be worked out on Capitol Hill also. Again, the incentives to increase employee retirement, the Postal Service has been doing that, and it's been working somewhat, not as well as they would have liked in most cases. But it's interesting. One of the things that I'm noting, postal employees, and again, I was there for a long time. I had a number of different jobs in addition to the congressional relations part. I was a postmaster for a while. But postal employees know. They know the problem is real. They know there's hardly any mail in the system. You go into plants and there's just not a whole lot of work. Mail carriers know there's far less mail volume that they're delivering every day. So they're very aware and they're very worried. The employees are about the future of the organization and about the future of their jobs. And I think that is one of the things that maybe is creating a little bit of an uptick in folks that are going ahead and taking the incentives and retiring, because I think they're worried about hanging around what that might portend. And another element I don't have on the slides, but the Postal Service in its press release yesterday threw it out again, and it's a key one for the Postal Service. It's a tough one politically, and that is they'd like when the Postal Service reaches an impasse in collective bargaining with one of its 4 unions, it goes to interest arbitration, a binding arbitration, and you have a 3-panel group of arbitrators. The Postal Service selects one, the union selects one, and the 2 arbitrators select the 3rd arbitrator. It's generally understood that it's the 3rd arbitrator that makes the decision on the baby. And the Postal Service very much wants to have the law changed so that the arbitration process, the arbitrators have to consider the financial condition of the Postal Service. That is not now a requirement. And the Postal Service has been pushing for that provision now for several years. As you might imagine, the postal unions are very dead set against that being included.
Yesterday, the Postal Service issued its annual report, Form 10-K, just like corporations do to the SEC, covering the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2002. The report is bleak. As Tony indicated, they've lost $16 billion. They've defaulted on $11 billion due in 2 Treasury payments for the last 2 years. They've maxed out on their statutory borrowing limit of $15 billion. And they're down to about $2.3 billion in cash, which is about 2 weeks of burn for them. They'll probably do okay for the rest of the year because this is the Christmas mailing season, and they've had also the boost of volume from the election advertising. But come sometime in the spring and summer of 2013, things are going to get really bad. And if the country falls over a financial cliff in the beginning of the year because of political gridlock, and we go into another recession, the Postal Service could run out of cash even sooner. But on present course, it's likely to occur sometime in 2013, unless there are changes. And in this report, by the way, which you send either Tony or me an email, we can send you a PDF of it. They admit they need help from Congress, or they're going to run into a brick wall. I'm going to quickly next over some of the reasons why the reforms that Tony talked about aren't going to be enough, and I'll skip things that he's already covered. Saturday delivery, they can't eliminate that with a change in law by Congress. Consolidating mail processing facilities, they project that their plans won't be completed for 2 to 3 years, and even when fully implemented, they'll only save about $2 billion a year. Consolidating retail post offices, in the face of political opposition, they have backed off from closing and now are talking about reducing staffing hours, the hours in which these plants are staffed, which of course is not going to eliminate the real estate and other fixed costs. Projected annual savings only $500 million a year. Reducing employee headcount and achieving rates of compensation that are comparable to the private sector. This is the elephant in the living room. The headcount exceeds the Postal Service needs by about 30%, or about 125,000 out of about 520,000 employees based on the Postal Service's 5-year plan. The average Postal Service employee gets $83,000, and estimates are that that is about 30 to 35% above what private sector jobs pay for comparable work. This is despite the fact that the law specifically requires pay comparability, but arbitrators don't enforce it, and the unions have managed, rationally behaving, have managed to keep or even increase the disparity in recent years. Some estimates are that correcting these 2 problems, the headcount and pay comparability, could save the Postal Service $19 billion a year, which if it had been in effect in 2012, it means the Postal Service would have been in surplus by several $billion instead of being in the red by $16 billion. But fixing that problem is an example of if pigs had wings, they could fly, because more than 85% of career employees are unionized, and most of the existing collective bargaining agreements have no layoff clauses. When there's a dispute in the terms of compensation or other collective bargaining terms, they go to arbitration. The arbitrators tend to split the baby rather than enforce pay comparability. The collective bargaining agreements run for terms of 3 to 5 years, so they can't be changed in midstream without the consent of the unions. And the result is that even with buyouts and reduced average work hours per employee, total compensation expense fell by only 2% in fiscal year 2012. So the Postal Service's cost-saving efforts, while they're valiant, they're falling further and further behind. Tony talked about the legacy costs of retiree health care funding and the retirement system overfunding of pensions, which now, according to the OPM, is less than projected. The other side of the ledger is increasing revenue, and the Postal Service has gained a lot more money from packages which are competitive and not regulated. But But the gain just isn't enough to offset the loss of contribution from the market dominant classes, particularly first-class mail, which has a much higher markup than anything else. New products and services, even if the Postal Service were allowed to provide them, it's not clear that they would make much money. In other countries that do non-postal services, the biggie is banking. You think the Postal Service is going to make money if it goes into banking? The busting of the CPI cap, the inflation index that caps rates, average rates for each class, well, mailers certainly oppose that. This firm representing A&M, MPA, DMA, and the Association for Postal Commerce, as well as a coalition of other mailer groups, successfully beat off an attempt to have an above-inflation increase in 2010, and we certainly would oppose it in the future because we think it's one of the few price constraints that mailers have as a protection. Now, what are the risks to nonprofit mailers if the Postal Service becomes insolvent? Well, first of all, let's talk about the risks that are common to all mailers. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Here, there we are. Worsened service, slower service earlier. Mailers have to enter their mail earlier to meet service standards earlier in the day or even a day earlier. And system breakdowns from aging technology and deferred maintenance. As you might expect in the Postal Service's current straits, it's spending a lot less on new technology and updating than it has in the past. Another risk is above CPI rate increases. Now, we talked under current law, you're not supposed to be, the Postal Service isn't supposed to be able to do that unless it loses money as a result of extraordinary or exceptional circumstances. If we plunge into another recession because the politicians can't work out a deal over the fiscal cliff, I think it's pretty likely the Postal Service will come back to the Commission asking for a rate increase because of exigent circumstances. We managed to fend that off in 2010. No guarantee we'll be able to do it again. In addition, you could have an above CPI increase legislated by Congress if things got desperate enough. The administration was floating that idea about a year ago. It didn't make it into the Senate and House bills, but it could resurface. Now let's talk about the risks of a default that are specific to nonprofit mail. The risk is the elimination of the nonprofit rate preference. For nonprofit standard mail, it's about 26% less than the commercial rate when you can control for weight and size and other billing determinants. For nonprofit periodical mail, it's a 5% discount. I know that's an important thing to most nonprofit mailers. But every now and then, and including in recent years, that there have been proposals to help the Postal Service's financial problems by getting rid of those preferences. It was proposed by the Postal Service in a solvency plan in March of 2010. It was suggested by the OIG in a blog in August of this year. And there was an earlier version of the House bill proposed to phase out nonprofit discounts, although that is not in the current version of the House bill. Now, since it's neither in the House or the Senate bill, you might say, well, we can relax. The problem is if the Postal Service hits a financial wall and just faces insolvency, can't meet payroll, the mail is going to stop moving, and Congress desperately gets together in the middle of the night to come up with a last-minute bailout, this could come out on the table, and it could end up in the legislation, in the sausage being made very fast before anyone has a chance to challenge or marshal opposition to it. So that is a real risk. And with that, I look forward to hearing from our two colleagues about how Congress is going to fix the problems.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, David. And next, Ann Fisher.
I'm going to leave Jeff to address how Congress will fix the problems. I'm here to tell you how we did fix the problems, we thought, in 2006. Tony asked me basically, and first I'll say everything I say today, they're my own thoughts. They do not necessarily reflect any of those of the Commission. And a lot of what I'll say today, too, is just talking about my past history working on postal reform. And Tony thought it might be interesting for you to hear sort of how the 2006 Act finally made it through the gates and was signed into law, because we're in a very similar situation today. I was working for Senator Collins for 4 years, on all of those on postal reform. And at the time, we always said, or a lot of people said, the stars were truly aligned to make postal reform happen at that time. And what that basically meant was that we had a president, President Bush, who was actively engaged in postal issues, or at least his cabinets were. He had established a presidential commission on the Postal Service to look at all the serious issues facing the Postal Service at that time. They made a multitude of regulatory and legislative recommendations that they then sent up to Congress. The House had been working on postal reform for a long time, John McHugh. And in the Senate, we had two new leaders on the postal issue, Senator Collins and Senator Carper, who were going to introduce a Senate bill for the first time. So beyond the fact that we had a lot of very engaged, very knowledgeable people on the issue, we also had a Republican in the White House, a Republican in the House, and a Republican-led Senate, which would lead you to believe that you might be able to get something through fairly smoothly, but that was not at all the case. And it just an interesting fact to point out was even then, with all three bodies being Republican-controlled, it was acknowledged that the labor costs were 80% of the Postal Service's problem. That there needed, it was important to try to find some way to rein those costs in, but it was impossible to get anything passed through Congress that would in any way substantially address those costs. I think at the end of the day, the best potential lever was a strict price cap. But you know, when I look back now, I think of what we were doing and what we were working and what was the focus of the postal reform legislation at that time, and it seems, I don't want to say insignificant, but it does seem like small potatoes compared to what they're facing today. We were looking at streamlining the rate setting process. We were looking at putting into place a rate cap. There was a desire to bring a lot more transparency to the day-to-day operations of the Postal Service. What we ended up haggling over at the very end, and that was keeping the bill from moving forward, was the exigency provision. And that was in the instance that the Postal Service faced some so dramatically serious financial situation that they had to go above and beyond the annual rate cap increase. Under what terms would an exigency case be allowed? And I think most of you know that aspect of the law has been tested. And we'll just move beyond from there. But just saying that was one of the final pieces that we were haggling over at that point. We were also working on very small adjustments to the workers' compensation legislation. I think just trying to put into place, again, something very small, a 3-day waiting period. Negotiated service agreements were still being discussed and worked on, and there were some fights over whether or not single-piece parcel posts should be in the competitive or the market-dominant category. So see, it really was small compared to what they're faced with now, but still virtually impossible to get through until, and this is where my hopeful news for today will come, we'd spent years working on this, and it was again during a lame duck when it really came to a head. And the staff had been talking for a long, long time. There wasn't the urgency for postal reform that there actually is now. But it took the members coming together, really wanting to make it happen. And I know that they're all there in the same mindset today. But at the basically the last day of that session is when they passed it. So I'm very hopeful that something will happen. I think everyone wants to see, all the key players involved in postal reform want to try to right the ship. They'd like to find a credible solution. I think it's very good news. I know that the staff have been talking throughout the entire process, but now most of us probably read the news today. The members have met as well. And I think that that's very important. That leads me to feel very hopeful. And, you know, in my old instincts as a former Senate staffer, I think there will be a tremendous desire to just be able to set the postal issue aside for a while, hopefully for a few more years, and begin this new Congress with a different plate of issues to contend with. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Hello. Thank you, Ann. I always wish I could, when I go and talk to groups, I wish I had great news about, the Postal Service taking off, or that everything would be okay tomorrow. Some people have kind of described me off and on as a grief counselor. It's a little rough, but first I do want to just thank all of you for being here and working with us on this issue. As David mentioned a little earlier, we had discussed the idea of basically doing a 13-year phase-in of a partial reduction of the nonprofit mail rate. As he mentioned, we've also moved away from that, and we are no longer pushing for any change in the nonprofit mail rate, except for one exception, which I did want to point out. Right now, state and national political committees actually have access to the nonprofit rate. If we're asking for cuts from everyone else, we decided it's about time that political parties actually pony up to the bar with some cuts. So in our bill, one of the provisions we're going to make sure stays in there is that state and national political committees will not be able to get access to the nonprofit rate day one after our bill is signed into law. So I mean, we think that's a bare minimum, but that's the only way we affect nonprofit rates. I think I'm not planning to speak for very long. I think all of the other speakers kind of went over the situation we're in. It's a very difficult one. I think my bosses and others want to get a deal done. We want something that fixes the Postal Service so that we are not dealing with this 2 years from now, or preferably longer than that. I mean, as other speakers have also mentioned, the 80% cost issue is very hard to ignore. If you actually go back and look in the 1960s, there were papers written about Postal Service labor costs, and they complained about how Postal Service labor costs were about 77% of all expenses. If you look this year, there's actually a nice little, I believe it's a graph in the 10K, it shows Postal Service labor costs were 81% of expenses. Back in the 1960s, you still had people riding around in mail cars, sorting the mail manually. There was no such thing as mechanized or automated sortation. And so from one perspective, it's kind of disappointing to see that as we've moved so far along in creating efficiencies, that labor costs still constitute such a high percentage of postal expenses. And going forward, I mean, it's clear to virtually everyone now that the Postal Service needs to cut costs. But to cut costs, that means we do have to do the harder things. That means we have to, be able to close mail processing facilities so that we can address the workforce costs. My boss has really been no part of a lot of that buzzsaw that Tony liked to mention about Congress trying to step in the way of a lot of costs. My boss has been well, he doesn't want to see 5-day mail. He's been a proponent of allowing the Postal Service to make that decision, and he's actually tried to step in and remove the annual law that the Congress passes that actually requires 6-day mail. Unfortunately, for procedural reasons entirely unrelated to postal, he's never actually had that opportunity to get the vote he's essentially requested. But I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have on where the bill's at, or anything that where the House what the House bill does, and as much as I can on anything else. If you guys would like any further details on our bill, there's actually what I believe is a wonderful law review article that was just published under the chairman's name in the Notre Dame Journal of Legislation. I believe it. I apologize, but for the moment the title escapes me. I believe it has Postal Reform Act, which is the title of the House bill, in the title. If anyone asks, I'm sure I can email the title to to Tony or David so that they can send it out to the group. But it's probably boring reading, but hopefully it'll help some of you get to sleep at night. But I guess with that, I'm happy to turn it over to any questions.
Before the questions, I just want to add one thing about the legislation that I think Jeff and Ann are probably too tactful to point out. The legislation, both the House and the Senate bills, are very complex, but it really boils down to this unavoidable fact of life. To make the Postal Service financially solvent, it's going to have financial relief. And there are only three sources of that: mailers, taxpayers, or postal labor. Mailers in the form of higher rates or lesser service, taxpayers even in the form of higher taxes now, or more likely additional loans and borrowing by the Postal Service that we know it won't be able to afford to repay, which means the taxpayers will pay it eventually down the road. And then labor, either in lower headcounts or a lower compensation. Each of those three interests is well represented on the Hill, and the result has been gridlock. In all likelihood, we're not going to have any party yield until the locomotive is already heading over the cliff. This is typically what happens. It happened with the railroad industry when it went insolvent in the 1970s, and that may very well be what happens here. I hope that Jeff and Ann's more optimistic view of that prevails, and that my pessimism is mistaken. Questions?
If the Postal Service became insolvent, would they be able?
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Keep talking.
Would they be able to renegotiate the labor contract?
Please repeat the question.
Repeat the question. Yeah. The question was, if the Postal Service became insolvent, could they renegotiate the labor contracts? Well, actually, the legal question of becoming insolvent or bankruptcy, I'll let David address that. As a government agency, that's a little tricky.
A federal government agency technically cannot go into bankruptcy court because the federal agency is part of the sovereign, and the sovereign can't be subject to another arm of the sovereign. It's sort of like sovereign immunity. And so bankruptcy court is a procedure where a court under legal standards decides who gets a haircut and who has to eat losses and how the losses of the business are to be divided among all of the stakeholders, the lenders, the shareholders, the employees, and the customers. The court can't do that because they don't have jurisdiction over the Postal Service. If the Postal Service runs out of money, Congress and the President will effectively act as a political bankruptcy court, and there will be a scramble to figure out some way to bail out the Postal Service, and it'll be a huge food fight over who has to absorb the losses, and that'll be the equivalent of bankruptcy.
If I could jump in for a moment, this issue of when is the Postal Service bankrupt, what does it mean, and how do we deal with it, has kind of been one of the fundamental questions as we tried to craft legislation. The very first idea we discussed was the very idea of putting the Postal Service in bankruptcy. About 10 seconds later, what David came up with occurred to us, which caused constitutional concerns. What happened is that actually led us to create the quote-unquote control board or solvency authority that's in our bill. We conceived them initially to act something like in some fashions like a bankruptcy type, and very initially, very early on in the process, we actually had the power, gave the authority the power to renegotiate collective bargaining agreements if certain savings goals weren't achieved voluntarily through union negotiations. Ultimately, to help win support of some of our more labor-friendly members, we changed it to a provision that what our bill would require is a prospective prohibition on no layoff clauses and a requirement that current postal bargaining contracts that have no layoff clauses be renegotiated under new terms that we set for arbitration that make it much more explicit that the Postal Service's financial condition and pay comparability have to be taken into account in the decision of an arbitrator. We went back to actually as Ann mentioned, the 2003 President's Commission on the Postal Service, and tried to write up a system to codify the arbitration method that they'd kind of created, and that we thought would mark in a much fairer manner as before. So
we have a question from one of our web participants. Please summarize both short and long-term impacts on nonprofit postal rates. What's the kind of current expectation for nonprofit rates? Is the expectation that they'll be preserved in the short term?
Yes, there is nothing pending in the House and the Senate that would eliminate the nonprofit rate preferences. There's nothing pending that would change eligibility for nonprofit rates, except, as Jeff mentioned, the provision of the House bill dealing with political committees. The more likely risks will be the two that I outlined. Number one, that there will be some emergency rate increase allowed to the Postal Service, either by the Commission or by Congress, that will hit all mailers, not just nonprofit mailers. And the other alternative risk is that in some sort of desperate political remedy, there will be a renewed assault on the nonprofit rate preference. That isn't on the table now. And under current law, because inflation is currently low, rate increases that nonprofits will face will be, like everybody else, will be relatively small. The rate increases that the Postal Service has filed for on market-dominant products that are currently pending and that will take effect in January are in the range of 2.6% on average. And that appears to be likely to hold at least until some new catastrophe happens financially sometime later down the road in 2013.
Yeah, back here.
Thank you. My name is Mark Mazzato with NCBS Manufacturers. We're part of the coalition for Postal Service to represent manufacturers. Part of the $8,500,000 this sector of the Postal Service is careful. Very concerned about that. In terms of the legislative situation, we have supported the Senate bill at 1789, supported the House going forward with HR. I guess it's one from Congress. A little bit more of a little bit going on in perhaps we're not going to be looking at anyone else who wants to comment on it. What type of process
And Jeff, be sure to repeat the question, at least the end part of the question.
I guess the end part of the question, and thank you for the question, was the idea of how would postal legislation get enacted in the lame duck. Is that a fair summary? Sadly, I think that's a question you probably have to pose to my boss in person. I'm not really at much liberty to discuss something like that right now. I don't know if anyone else is.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I don't have to worry about being fired on this one. Again, the lame duck, as Ann mentioned, and I recall the 06 Act, it really picked up in December of 06, the discussions, and it took to the last night in the middle of the night for it finally to be done of lame duck. And that scenario, if it gets done, I'm just my hunch. If something gets done, it probably will go to the last hour like it did before. That's typically the way things are done on the Hill. And I think, number one, the problem is far bigger now. I think there's more visibility to it. That helps in terms of possibility something might get done. As Jeff alluded to, and Ann sure knows, postal politics are incredibly thorny and challenging. All members of Congress hate postal politics because they get hammered from all different directions. and it's a real thorny area. And I know the principals in this thing from the House and the Senate. They very much like to get this thing done and get it behind them, and not have to start all over again in the next Congress with the same issues. They're not going to be any easier to deal with. So I think there's a real desire to get things done. On the other hand, it appears to me you now have, and again, this is my personal projection, you now have with the crisis even greater, you probably have a little greater leverage going for it on the House side with the House bill, because the House bill, as most people know, is more aggressive. It deals more aggressively with cost control than the Senate bill, which is a milder version. So I think the House position has been bolstered here recently. And you also have a change, if it doesn't get done, that perhaps would change the dynamics next year in the 113th Congress, and that is Senator Collins would no longer be the ranking minority in the Governmental Affairs Committee, and Senator Lieberman would no longer be chairman. So those two members would be replaced by Senator Carper, who will be chairman of the full committee, and Senator Coburn of Oklahoma, who will become the ranking minority member. Senator Coburn, if you've seen him in hearings and you watch the markups, his approach appears to be more akin to Mr. Ice's in terms of more aggressive cost control. So I mean, the dynamics might be a little bit different in the next Congress if it gets that far. In terms of getting it done this year, I sure hope it gets done, Mark, and we'll see. I don't think you would project that the tougher approach. You would see Mr. Issa and some of the folks that want to take a little tougher approach. I don't project that they will back off that position. If anything, they're probably emboldened now because the problem's worse than anybody had thought it was going to be.
I can jump in and say we're not going to back off.
So, and there was, if you all saw, there was a CQ alert this morning that suggested in a meeting yesterday of the principals, the members themselves, Senator Lieberman, who chairs the committee, and that he perhaps, this article suggests, that he threw out a further compromise on Saturday delivery. The Senate bill, as passed by the Senate this year, would allow, once the bill is signed into law, 2 years after that, if the GAO were to confirm the Postal Service had exhausted every other avenue available to them to reduce costs, if the GAO could certify that, then the Postal Service would have the ability to eliminate Saturday delivery if it so chose. In the article that, again, the CQ article this morning, Senator Lieberman threw out a compromise suggestion, supposedly in this principals meeting yesterday, where he said, it looks like we can't wait that long, and he threw on the table the idea of allowing the Postal Service to eliminate Saturday delivery but retain parcel delivery on Saturday. That's a big move if it goes that direction. Again, that's the big one the Postal Service really wants. You look at trying to close you got the health benefit retiree problem aside, but you got about a $5 billion gap between costs and revenue right now without that issue on the table. And you can go a long way if you can save about $3 billion on Saturday delivery. So that's a little bit of movement that's encouraging.
A question from the webcast, and I hope we have the question right. So is it possible for the Postal Service to raise rates to 100% of cost coverage on its own, or does it need Congress's approval to do so?
Under current law, the Postal Service is not only allowed but required to have 100% cost coverage plus a little more for competitive services like many kinds of parcels. For market-dominant products, which include both nonprofit periodical mail and nonprofit standard mail, those are regulated, and not only the Postal Service can't raise rates up to 100% for a class if a class is below water, but the Commission can't either. That was the central provision of the CPI cap on rates that Congress enacted in 2006, that the average rate per class of mail for Class On an average cannot go up faster than the Consumer Price Index. And that the view of the clients that we represent, the Alliance of Nonprofit Mailers, MPA, who's here in the room, and other trade associations, is that cap trumps the attributable cost floor. And because otherwise mailers really have no real protection against runaway costs. Now, you may ask, well, isn't that a problem? Well, yes, it certainly is a problem, but the solution to the problem, in our view, is for the Postal Service to cut its bloated costs.
We have another question from the webcast. No one may know the answer to this, and we may not want to answer it, but what would be the yearly incremental additional revenue to the Postal Service if nonprofit discounts went away and mail volume remained the same?
That is a hard one to answer. You could take the simplistic way to look at it would be to say, what is the current revenue paid by nonprofit mail, nonprofit periodical mail, and increase that by a little more than 5%, and nonprofit standard mail, and increase that by about 30%, and that could be several $100 million a year. And that's one way of looking at it. The problem is first of all, nonprofit mail would decline, and second of all, the nonprofit organizations, as everyone in this room knows very well, don't just mail nonprofit mail. They mail products. They mail first-class mail. They fulfill products with parcels and other things that are not at nonprofit rates. And if nonprofit outbound mail were reduced, particularly solicitation mail, the piggyback classes of mail that it generates in widening ripples would be lost as well. So the advantage would be the extra revenue, the net revenue would be considerably diminished if it exists at all. And in addition to the extent that nonprofit organizations had fewer funds to carry out their charitable missions, there would be additional demands for substitute services by the government, again providing offsetting rate increases. And some of us think that nonprofit organizations can handle some kind of charitable activities more efficiently and at a lower cost on the government. So again, whether there would be any net benefit to the Postal Service or to the society as a whole is very much in dispute.
Any other questions here in the room for our speakers? Well, with that, I want to thank all of our speakers for a terrific presentation today. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend and a great holiday. Thank you.